Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome to week 10 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Every Monday, I like to start things off. I like to start the week off with a meta review, usually covering budget decks, best of 3, and best of 1. However, this week there was an issue with the standard challenge. I'm not sure if it didn't take place or if the matches just weren't recorded on the Modo website. Either way, we won't be covering best of 3 this week. So, but I'd like to start things off with Boros Convoke. And so if you're new here, welcome. And what I like to do is I like to use a third-party tracker called Untapped. And this way I can see what's working for the majority for a large group of people, not just a specific meta within a specific rank, but what's working the best for Bronze to Mythic. So, according to the tracker, the number 1 was Untapped. If you are returning to Magic, which a lot of my viewers are returning to Standard after a period of time, welcome back. And Boros Convoke, just a quick summary, is focused on overwhelming your opponent with a swarm of low-cost creatures that then can enable a turn 2 Convoke with the Knight Errant of Eos. So with the Gleeful Demolition being able to sacrifice a token off of Novice Inspector or the Voldaren Epicure, you can get to be able to tap 5 things on turn 2. And it's a lot of pressure for your opponent to deal with. And then after going wide, you take advantage of the wide board presence by doing some form of pump. So cards like the Case of the Gateway Express deal damage equal to the number of creatures you have. And then if you attack with 3 or more, you get an Anthem effect. Everything gets +1/+0, and that's permanent. You also have like the Sanguine Evangelist. When it attacks, it has Battle Cry, giving everything +1/+0. Imidane's Recruiter is a great turn 3 to follow up after a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, because it gives everything +1/+0 and haste. So you're attacking it with a 3/2 attacker plus all of your board. And then War Leader's Call, which this list is not running. So the other thing that I like to do is I like to look at how the lists change over the weeks. So typically what I'll do is I'll list kind of what cards have been subbed out and what cards have been brought in to kind of give you an idea of what the flex spots are in the build and what if I don't mention the cards, then it's kind of considered part of the core. So for the creatures, this list dropped the Yoshin Frontliner, which works. It's the artifact creature for 1 colorless that has Unearth and does give you an additional Gleeful Demolition target. Dropped the and then brought in 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, and we see this one kind of come and go. It's particularly nice for giving you some life gain cushion against Mono-Red, and specifically Mono-Red Prowess, or any version of the Slickshot Show-Off that we'll cover here shortly, is trying to do a whole bunch of damage in one go, and Lunarch Veteran, even if you can get 3 or 4 life, can kind of help you get out of range of the Mono-Red decks. And then we Sanguine Evangelist. This one we've seen fluctuate completely to 0. Sometimes it gets removed. A lot of times the Sanguine Evangelist is being run instead of the War Leader's Call. And so this one deciding to run it instead. And this one kind of gives you a stickier board presence. So if you are bumping into Wraths, the fact that this leaves a 1/1 bat token behind is actually quite relevant. And then as far as the spells go, like I mentioned, we dropped the 3 copies of the War Leader's Call. Some lists will be running the Case of the Gateway Express and the War Leader's Call. War Leader's Call being better against the more grindy matchups and like Azorius Control. And then this one's dropping 1 copy of the Case of the Gateway Express. A lot of lists will run 4. And this one's one that we don't see very often, but I actually like it. Bringing in 2 copies of the Lightning Helix. And one of the things that helps against Mono-Red Prowess, not Mono-Red Aggro, is having instant speed interaction. So being able to destroy their Slickshot Show-Off after they've plotted it and they're trying to hit it with a bunch of spells. Typically, Boros Convoke is a little bit weak to that interaction because the Case of the Gateway Express is only at sorcery speed. So Lightning Helix giving you that ability for the spot removal, sort of like Get Lost, but then giving you the 3 life can also help stabilize, along with the Lunarch Veteran, getting out of reach of the Mono-Red Prowess decks. As far as the lands go, we see some just kind of back and forth about whether or not they're running 2 copies of the Agonjo and 2 copies of the Sokenzons, which will be rotating this August 2nd. Do keep that in mind if you're new to Magic the Gathering, that we're about to, in a month and a bit, we're going to be seeing a rotation where 3 sets are leaving Standard. So we're going to be losing the Neon Dynasty Legendary lands. But this one dropped one Aganjo, one Mountain, one Sokenzon, and brought in the Sundown Pass to give us a little bit more fixing for the Boros space, and then one additional copy of Mirix. And this one can also be handy for casting your off-color spells for a turn. And then sometimes we see Cavern of Souls going up, depending on the list is primarily humans, outside of like the Voldarian Epicure and the Sanguine Evangelist, which are vampires. But the more that you see the case of the Gateway Express and the like Lightning Helixes, Gleeful Demolition, War Leader's Call, the more that it strays away from a 100% creature deck, then you see a Cavern of Souls decrease with time. Number 2, according to Untapped, was Gruul Aggro, and this is one of those slick shot show-off decks. So again, a quick little summary. The addition, you're going to see a lot of different versions of slick shot show-off, whether it be Rakdos Aggro, Gruul Aggro, Boros Heroic, or just Mono-Red Prowess. And it's all centered around this card that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which allows us to push an incredible amount of damage as long as you are focusing on casting non-creature spells, all in one turn. So it's kind of the premise of the deck is largely built around the slick shot show off. And then the question about whether or not you are going to be adding in additional colors kind of depends on whether or not the cards that you're playing are going to be beneficial to the increased mana variance of playing in a 2-color space. So the addition of green allows you to have additional trample. So we have the Monstrous Rage, which gives a creature trample by having the monster roll, but Audacity also gives the creature trample. And then a similar kind of like drawing a card if the creature dies can help kind of refuel the hand, which is where the Questing Druid comes in. And so the Gruul space is kind of looking to have a little bit more of the card advantage off of the Seek the Beast and a little bit more trample. And then Giant Growth is almost like a lightning bolt because of the amount of prowess creatures. It's almost better than a lightning bolt, getting the additional damage here. So you can deal 5 damage with one spell if your slick shot show off is not dead. So some lists do run Snakeskin Veil as a way to kind of protect our slick shot show off. This list is not doing that. But basically, yeah, the overall strategy is to deploy cheap aggressive creatures and then burst for a massive amount of damage in one turn. So a lot of times you're going to want to plot this. And there's a decision to be made if you do turn 1 Kumano about whether or not you play out the slick shot show off as a 2/3 flyer, or if you plot it so that you can get like 3 spells to give it +6 before it gets destroyed. And that's kind of like the big deciding factor in this deck. And then we also have kind of a double strike theme, so Picnic Ruiner and Cacophony Scamp. Picnic Ruiner gets double strike if its power is above 4, and then Cacophony Scamp can deal 2 times its damage. If it gets through, you can sacrifice it to deal its damage to any target. And so these kind of giving you that same burst effect of can we just end our opponent in one turn. And you can pretty consistently end the game in this archetype by turn 3, usually by turn 4, but occasionally by turn 3, if your opponent isn't running a lot of spot removal. So I haven't really talked about the Gruul Aggro list for a little bit. Typically the Rakdos Aggro space has been better, but this week we're seeing a little bit more direct damage going towards the Slick Shot Show-Off, which then the Giant Growth can help stabilize and protect. Not as great if you're seeing a whole bunch of mono black. But as far as the changes go to the creatures, they've dropped the 4 copies of the Yavmaya Iconoclast, which is the you have a red kicker, and it comes in as a 4/3 trample haste, and the 4 power working with the Picnic Ruiner to be able to give it double strike. So we're leaning a little bit further away from that, as well as dropping the Questing Druids by 2, down from 4, and bringing in the Slick Shot Show-Off. So originally back in week 5 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, this list was just leaning off of the Cacophony Scamp and Picnic Ruiners, trying to get a one-turn kill. And Slick Shot Show-Off works perfectly fine in the strategy that's running so many one-costed spells. And then as far as the lands go, dropped 2 copies of the Rockfall Vale, which I really like. I do not like the slow land in this archetype because you are usually running a pretty low land count. And instead, bringing the mountains up to a total of, bringing in 4 more mountains. Because we have decreased the amount of green cards in the deck, I don't think we need this Rockfall Vale, where the tap land can be particularly bad to our turn 3 tempo. Number 3, according to Untapped, was Mono White Humans, And this has been my favorite deck to climb the ladder with, and for many, many weeks, Mono White Humans was number one. And so it's been it's been thrown off of the number one seat by Boros Convoke. And one of so again, the general strategy, the general summary for those who are returning to Magic, basically what you're trying to do is disrupt your opponent's non-creature spells by Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and protecting Thalia, Guardian of Thraben with the Coppercoat Vanguard. All of the creatures in the deck are humans, so you get this human synergy that gives everything +1/+0 and has Ward 1, which can be very difficult for your opponent to then get through the ward and the tax to actually deal with the Thalia that's been played. And traditionally, Mono White Humans has been a very good deck against Mono-Red Aggro, and the Intrepid's Adversary being able to give you the early lifelink damage, as well as the 4 toughness on Adeline Resplendent Cathar, has been really hard for Mono-Red Aggro to get over, at least the traditional build prior to kind of the Outlaws of Thunder Junction meta. And so what we see with the addition of the Mono-Red Prowess deck, similar to like the Gruul Aggro deck that we just talked about, since it's trying to do a bunch of damage all at once, and especially through Slickshot Showoff, which has flying, then Mono White Human struggles a little bit more in that matchup. And so what we see here is we see an adaptation to the archetype to try to improve its matchup to Mono Red Prowess, as well as make it a little bit more relevant against the Boros Convoke as it's rising in popularity, because Boros Convoke is just better at going wide than we are. So how do we kind of fight that? And I think there's some interesting ideas here that are at least being explored this week. And so again, if I compare this one to last week, we can see that we cut the 4 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, which, similar to the Boros Convoke, is usually included as a way to stabilize against Mono Red. We brought out the 2 copies of Skrelv, which is a way to kind of even lean heavier into the guard the Guardian of Thraben, make sure Thalia doesn't get killed. And then we're dropping the 2 copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky. Again, Boros Convoke being able to create more tokens, the Warden of the Inner Sky is stronger in that matchup. Same with the Sanguine Evangelist and the Knight Errant at Eos. So a lot of the cards that were originally in Mono White Humans have found their home in Boros Convoke and are better in that Boros Convoke archetype. So we're ditching that plan, and I like that. So what we're doing instead, though, is we're bringing back some old familiar faces like Hopeful Initiate. This one being able to give you some artifact and enchantment hate can help you on that Case of the Gateway Express and War Leader's Call in the Boros Convoke matchup. And then Training can actually apply a lot of pressure, especially with Recruitment Officer and Thalia being at 2 power. And on early plays, you can end up training this one quite well. And then Adeline can get huge, and Hopeful Initiate gets huge right along with it. So another one that we see, though, because we're ditching the Skrelv, there's still a lot of point interaction or single spot removal in the meta. And instead, so what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the 4 copies of the Guardian of New Benalia. And it's been a long time since we actually saw this all the way up to 4. Sometimes we see this as a 1 of, sometimes not at all. And so running a full 4 right here, because you have the ability to discard to give it indestructible until end of turn. So it's really good against the cut downs and go for the throats in black, as well as the removal in red. And can apply a lot of pressure to our opponent. And then giving us some dig that we were getting off of the Warden of the Inner Sky, we're now getting from the Guardian of New Benalia. And we did bring the Thalia all the way up to 4. Last week, Thalia was dropped down to 3. Kind of depends on how many non-creature spells the meta is running. The more pure creature lists, like the Mono White Humans build, Thalia then becoming significantly worse. And we're bringing in 3 copies of the Phyrexian Vindicator. And I really like this because if we're not going to be 2 colors in Boros Convoke, then we can take advantage of playing one of the stronger but more difficult to cast white cards. So Phyrexian Vindicator is a 5/5 flyer for 4 white, and if damage was dealt to it, you prevent damage, and it deals that much damage to any other target. So this is a good way to soak up damage from a Knight Errant at Eos and also remove one of their attackers, or just hit them in the face. And so we're ditching the Ossification, which was the only non-creature spell in the list, and instead we're bringing in Elspeth's Smite and the 2 copies of March of Otherworldly Light. And these are really chosen for a specific reason. So they're both instances, which allows you to attack the Slickshot Showoff again, your instant speed and interaction is your best way to deal with the Mono-Red Prowess build. And then March of Otherworldly Light is specifically good against Boros Convoke because you can remove the artifact that they're trying to sacrifice with the Gleeful Demolition, and you can prevent their turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos play. So I really like the direction that this is headed in. Again, this one isn't a archetype that I think is going to survive rotation because we are going to be losing some of the key cards come August 2nd. But until then, I definitely am going to continue to love the mono-white space. And as far as the lands go, we dropped one Mishra's Foundry to bring in an additional copy of a Gonjo Seed of the Empire, which again, the channel effect is another way that we can kind of target the Slickshot show-offs. Number 4, according to Untapped, is Mono-Red Aggro, and this is kind of a good way to showcase what I mean about the difference between Mono-Red Aggro and Mono-Red Prowess, but the two archetypes are starting to blend together. Originally, the difference between Mono-Red Aggro was running Godric and Squee and being a little bit more creature-focused or creature-centric, and instead of the Prowess decks, which were running Slickshot Show-Off and more high number of spells to benefit off of the Prowess, like Ancestral Anger. And so what we see here is we see Slickshot Show-Off being included. We don't see Ancestral Anger being included. But the point of Mono-Red Aggro and the advantage to Mono-Red Aggro over Mono-Red Prowess is that it is not as weak, or it is more resistant to spot removal from your opponent. So we're going to see, I'll showcase it when I go through the cards. So if we compare this one to last week, we see Phoenix Chick getting dropped down by 1. In best of 3, this one you see go all the way down to 0. Typically in best of 1, you usually see at least 2 copies of Phoenix Chick. And then Bloodthirsty Adversary, which is the 2/2 that can be paid with a sort of a kicker when it enters the battlefield for a total of 5 to replay a spell from your graveyard. That one's being removed, as well as the 2 copies of Felden, Ronom Excavator, which is the one that can't block and gives you good dig, and the 3 copies of Godric, Godric Cloaked Reveler, which is the one that has the celebration and becomes a 4/4 flyer that can give your dragons +1/+0 for 1 red. And instead, we're seeing more of the Prowess creatures. So we're seeing the Fugitive Codebreaker, as well as 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off. And so we're ditching the 3 copies of Nahiri's Warcrafting, which is kind of like the Witchstalker Frenzy, but costs 3 instead of 4. And that's particularly important if you are running the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, because the Bloodthirsty Adversaries can replay Nahiri's Warcrafting, and it gives you a little bit of dig. And but this one deciding to bring in the Witchstalker's Frenzies instead. Also 1 copy of Chandra Dressed to Kill. We kind of see this one come and go from being included or not, depending on the week. This one, again, being better against the control matchups and sweepers, because sweepers don't hit planeswalkers. And then Monstrous Rage, bringing this one back up to 4. Sometimes we've seen this kind of drop down to 3. So, and then the Witchstalker Frenzy, the advantage here being that if you are going wide with enough of a board from like Squee and your Phoenix Chicks and whatnot, then this can cost way less than the Nahiri's Warcrafting and give you the spot removal that you need, and can be useful for eliminating the Slickshot Show-Off if you are up against Mono-Red Prowess. And we're also bringing in 3 copies of the Urbrask's Forge, and this one, usually you see this more in best of 3 than you do in best of 1. It really depends on the tempo of the meta. And so Urbrask's Forge being kind of the answer to eventually I'm going to overrun you. Every turn, my X1 Phyrexian Horrors get bigger and they have Trample and Haste. And so this one, as long as they're not running Artifact Hate, will eventually win you the game. And so this is kind of the answer for if you're coming up against the control matchups or the mid-range decks. And kind of makes you slower, though, if you are strictly in the mono-red mirror match. So if we see part of what we're seeing is because the Slickshot Show-Offs have been teched against, we're seeing a decrease in the mono-red, at least drop a little bit in popularity. It's no longer 30% of the matches. It's only like 15 or whatever. It's still a very popular choice. But since we see a decrease in that, allows us to play the Forge. If we see more of the Mono-Red Prowess start to spike again at the beginning of the new season in July, then I imagine we'll have to see the Forge get pulled, and I hope that makes sense. So we're dropping 1 copy of the Mishra's Foundry and bringing out 1 Mountain. Since we're lowering the top part of our curve by removing out the Godric's and the Nahiri's Warcrafting and the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, which really like to hit 5 mana. We don't need as many sources of mana in the deck. And number 5 is Selesnya Enchantments. And just really quickly for the summary, basically you're using a whole bunch of enchantment synergies. So I think almost everything in the deck is an enchantment or has some interaction with enchantments. And so basically what we're trying to do is use the Weaver of Harmony, which has the ability to copy an activated or triggered ability of an enchantment. So we can like double the Mashiko's Reign of Truth pump. We can double the removal off of Ossification. We've got the Jukai Naturalist, which makes all of our enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast. And then we also have Calyx, which if it or a creature that is enchanted by something like Audacity deals damage to our opponent, we then get to copy an enchantment and we can make more Mashikos or more Ossifications and just it snowballs. So it was one of those decks that's very linear and you just kind of snowball out of control. A little prone to early interaction that prevents the snowball from growing. And last week, 2 weeks ago, in week 8 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we finally saw some changes to this archetype. This one's been around since Neon Dynasty, and we got Calyx in Aftermath, I believe. We saw some explorations finally being had, and it's reverted back to the tried and true, though. So we see Catilda being dropped back down to 1, and we see Yenna, the Red Tooth reagent, getting removed from the list, and bringing back in the 2 copies of Audacity and the 1 copy of Commune with Spirits. And this is another reason why I like to talk about the changes throughout the weeks, is that, like, you know, it's possible that it's an exploration that's not actually going to stick. And so it's nice to know kind of like this is a return to the original build that has been tested for many, many years. But because a lot of it is centered off of the Neon Dynasty cards and cards that are going to be rotating, this is another archetype that's going to retire in August. So craft with care. The other thing, too, that's a little bit of a debate. Every now and then we'll see kind of a change in the amount of pain lands that are being run in the archetype. So this one dropping the 4 copies of Brushland and not running Boseiju and Agonjo, which I think I would include, but instead just running the basics, 3 more forests and 2 more plains. And then number 6 is Azorius Control, and this one is, some people love Azorius Control, some people hate playing against it, and I think it's a fun deck to pilot. I think it's a less fun deck to play against, because Azorius Control is all about focusing on card advantage and board control and disrupting your opponent's plays to eventually outvalue them and outlast your opponent, so it's a very slow and grindy deck, and then you win the game eventually through attrition and resource denial. So your opponent gets really used to trying to do something and you're like, no, which can be fun. But if we compare this one to week 9 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, then we can see that they brought in a 4th copy of the Wandering Emperor, deciding to drop 1 copy of the Jace, the Perfected Mind. Now, this change showcasing a little bit of a decrease in Azorius Control, Jace being one of your better tools for milling out the mirror match. And then Tishana's Tidebinder coming in, though, which is a sign that usually Azorius Control is on the rise. So better against the activated abilities of the Planeswalkers of your mirror match opponent. Tishana's Tidebinder is a little bit worse against Boros Convoke and the Mono-Red matchups because of the 3/2 body not being a particularly good one. So kind of curious to see this change. Then again, though, Azorius Control is always trying to stay 1 step ahead of the meta with its main deck options. So we see one additional copy of Depopulate, so that we can play basically Sunfall 1 turn earlier, but it doesn't exile. So weaker against like Squee, but better if you're getting steamrolled. And then bringing in 1 copy of Farewell, which is the opposite direction of Depopulate, being a little bit slower, but being able to exile the graveyard, which is particularly relevant in the Temur Landfall, or the Temur Landfall combo deck, Temur Control. A little bit more common to see in best of 3 than you see in best of 1, because then it also hits the Slogurk decks that you don't usually see in the best of 1 ladder climb. And but we're dropping the 2 copies of Get Lost, and I really like the spot removal, especially with the amount of Slickshot show-offs. Now, again, maybe because the meta has shifted so heavily against the Mono-Red Prowess deck, maybe we're starting to see a decrease in the numbers for that deck. and Get Lost being a little bit less relevant than just the sweepers to manage the Boros Convoke. So that's kind of what I interpret here, is that we're seeing a decrease in Mono-Red Prowess and increase in Boros Convoke that then Azorius Control is trying to be prepared for. And as far as the lands go, we see they dropped the Meticulous Archive, which is the Surveil land for Azorius, and dropped one copy of the Mirrex. Again, another sign that kind of points to there being less of the mirror match. And maybe the Tidebinder was being brought in as a tool against Boros Convoke, because you can hit Knight Errant of Eos and you can hit Imidane's Recruiter and shut them down. Personally, I don't like this card as a tech against Boros Convoke just because of the body. But I do know that some people like to do that. And then as far as the lands go, we've gone up 1 Plains and up 1 Sea Chrome Coast. And really, this is just to reflect the additional white sweepers that we're bringing in. And number 7 was Mono-Red Prowess, just straight up Mono-Red Prowess, which is very similar to this deck, and very similar to Gruul Aggro. You're trying to center your strategy around the Slickshot Show-Off, and you play aggressive threats that then synergize with the pump spells through Prowess. And then you decide to stay strictly just in the red space to kind of decrease the mana variance of not having the right colors, and increase the consistency of your deck. So if you would like the list of the Mono-Red Prowess that everybody is teching so heavily against, I suggest going back to my meta review from last week, where I did cover that deck. So there were no changes, so I'll be skipping it this week. But I think you'll get a basic idea of what the deck is doing, because Rakdos Aggro is very similar to that build. This one basically being a Mono-Red Prowess build, except for we're bringing in black, sometimes not even necessarily bringing in black mana, to be able to do the Burn Together sorcery adventure off of Callous Sellsword, which allows us to fling our really big pumped up creature at our opponent. So it's kind of like Double Strike, but it's even better with the Cacophony Scamp, because if this is unblocked, you then can sacrifice it to the Burn Together to deal its power, and then because it dies, it deals its power again. So you get 3 times the power of your Scamp with the Callous Sellsword. So it's leaning a little bit more heavily on this card than just the strictly mono-red build. And we do see some, so Rakdos Aggro once upon a time was the #1 list in the meta, and it has fallen all the way down to number 8. So there's been some heavy tech against it. As I mentioned, a lot more spot removal being brought into the meta to account for this deck specifically. And so we do see some changes that are trying to add a little bit of resiliency to that strategy and to play around the spot removal from our opponent. So we've dropped the 2 copies of Feldon, Ronom Excavator, and the 4 copies of Slickshot Show-Off. And that one's the big one, because your opponent's going to be like, all right, I'm saving my removal for the Slickshot Show-Off, I'm up against red, and then it never comes. We're bringing the Callous Sellsword back up to 4. Sometimes this got dropped down to 3, because it can be awkward if you have 4 of these in your hand and nothing to sacrifice. But this one, I think I like 4 just because, like, it depends on how heavily you're going to lean into the fling strategy, and this list is leaning into it quite heavily. We're also bringing in 4 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker, and instead of the Slickshot Show-Off. And I'm not sure how I really feel about that. This one does have the ability to rebuild your hand through the disguise, and we are playing a lot of spells that go into the graveyard, so then the Codebreaker can actually refuel quite well. Curious to see if this is actually going to perform better than the Slickshot Show-Off over time. And we're also dropping the Ancestral Anger, which is kind of the staple of the Mono-Red Prowess, in my opinion, because it gives you you can cast more spells, since it gives you the card draw as well as giving the creature trample. So it really helps push the damage through. And we're also dropping 1 copy of the Thelonious Rage, and this one pairing particularly well with the Picnic Ruiner, because you can immediately give it haste, and then it has double strike as long as it has power 4 or more. So leaning a little bit further away from that, as well as the dropping 2 copies of the Antagonize and bringing in a full playset of Blazing Crescendo. And if you go back and you look at my build for Rakdos Aggro, I did a split between Antagonize and Blazing Crescendo, and this one giving you more dig, but at the cost of dealing a little bit less damage. So I feel like having a little bit of both is okay. I guess a 4-1 split instead of, like, I think I ran like maybe a 2-2 split or 2-3 split. Anyway, similar idea. and we're going to bring in the one additional copy of the Mirren Banesplitter. This one, again, being a card that's better with the Picnic Ruiners, since you can permanently make its power 4 or more. And so if you're dropping out your Picnic Ruiners, you're going to want to take out your Mirren Banesplitters. But they do synergize well together. And then we're bringing in one case of the Crimson Pulse, and we kind of see this one come and go, depending, again, on the speed. So this one is leaning a little bit, in my opinion, further away from the turn 3 win, and looking for more dig to give us a little bit more reach, where we can then win through a fling for lethal. So as far as the lands go, we also see an increase in the amount of lands to then take advantage of the Blazing Crescendo and the Case of the Crimson Pulse, which wants a larger amount of lands. So we're bringing it all the way up from 18 to 20. And so we're 2 more mountains. We're dropping the Sokenzon, which I think you could bring the Sokenzon back in if you really wanted to, over a mountain. And we're bringing in 1 Sulphurous Springs, which sometimes, like I said, we see a strict list of just red. The Sulphurous Springs giving us at least the possibility that we can hard cast the Callous Sellsword. And so if you drop your Callous Sellswords down from 4, then there's really no reason to be running the black land. So hope that gives you a good idea of the top performing decks in the meta. It's always nice to know what your opponent is playing, and I hope this gives you an idea of how to beat those decks and kind of how the meta rotates over time. And I do enjoy doing these, so I hope you enjoy them too. Let me know if you like them in the comments. Always hearing back from you guys always makes my day. And I'll be back next Monday to do another best of 1, best of 3 meta review. And hopefully the standard challenge will be back for best of 3. And on Sundays, I do a Meta Breakers, which is kind of off-meta picks. So, and then I ask you guys to place your vote on which off-meta pick you would like to see me play for each Saturday video. So you can head on over to the community tab for some exploration. You can look at Sunday's video if you want some ideas that are outside of the top 8 decks in the meta. And yeah, I'll be posting my Arena Open here tomorrow, I think, and just some explorations throughout the week if I can get to it. And yeah, so thanks for listening to my ramblings, and take care, everybody. Good luck with your matches, and I'll see you all next week.